In this video, we're going to be making this castle using basic primitive shapes. I'm just going to move this image to my second screen and use it as reference. So to get started, the first thing that I'm going to do is drop the ground plane that the castle is sitting on. So that's not one of the basic primitives, so what I'm going to do is just make sure that my mesh is selected over here, and I'm going to hold the Shift key. What that's going to do is it's going to change this font button into a plane. So we have an empty mesh over here that's just called mesh. Hold Shift, left click once, and it's going to drop a plane into our scene. So over here you can see that it actually named it plane, and we have this empty box right here that's just, or empty mesh right here that's just called mesh. So in the copy paste video, I showed you having the ability to work in different meshes. In this case, I'm actually just going to work in one mesh. So let's go ahead and delete this mesh so I can either hit the little X button right here or right click and go down to delete, either or. And then up here, I'm just going to rename this so I can either make sure that it's selected and left click on it one more time, or I can just right click and at the top is rename. I'm just going to name this castle. So just for reference to know what we're working with size-wise, if I hold the Control key and click on a box, what it's going to do is put that 1 meter by 1 meter box down, and I can see that it's kind of the same size as this guy right here as far as the width and length. So let's just delete this box. So I know that this, right now, this plane is 1 meter by 1 meter. So I'm not going to worry about building this castle to scale per se, but I will just go ahead and take this plane, scale it up a little bit more. So over here, it's at about 400%. So if I wanted to manually do that, again, I can either go in here and hit 400 for all of these one at a time, or if I just hit this little circle right here, that's going to kind of constrain all of them. I can hit 400, hit enter, it sets them all to 400, and then I can hit the escape key to drop that scale tool. So you don't necessarily have to scale it up if you don't want to. You can build a smaller castle, but the main reason I did that is because now if I was to put in a primitive shape at the default size, it's not kind of hidden within the primitive shape that I make. I can kind of see the rest of what's going on. So what we're going to do first is let's just go ahead and build those 4 outside cylinders, the kind of towers for the castle. So let's just make those one at a time. So the first thing I'm going to do is hold the Control key and click on the cylinder. So I have my first cylinder here, and you can see that the ground plane came in right on the grid, and this one's coming in kind of centered on the grid. So this will happen, and that's okay. Ideally, you want to try to set things on top of this grid like this plane is. So I'm just going to double click in polygon mode, switch to my move tool, and move this guy up. So he's kind of just sitting on the plane. And if I wanted this to be perfect, I could jump into snapping tools. We won't worry about that now. I'm just going to go to the front camera. I know that it's sitting on this black line, so I can just move it down, maybe just have it penetrating just a little bit like that. So we can switch back to the perspective view. And if you got a good angle of where you're seeing this and you just kind of place it, it doesn't need to be perfect. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this, just use the scale tool. So I can either hit the scale button right here, or I can hit the R key if you like hotkeys. I'm just going to scale this in, hit W, or go over here and hit the move tool. And again, I want to move it left and back at the same time. So instead of doing that in 2 motions, I'm just going to grab this little green guy right here, and that's going to constrain it to only being able to move left and right and front and back, and just move it over here to the corner, about right there. So now this feels a little bit high, so I'm just going to hit the space bar to drop my move tool, and then I'm going to click on the top polygon, hit the move widget again, and just scale this down a little bit, or I guess move it down. So I'm going to hit the escape key. So now I'm happy with where this is at shape-wise. So let's go ahead, double click it in polygon mode. We're going to do a copy paste. And again, what that's going to do is it's going to, when I hit the paste key, it's going to re-put down another one of these shapes in the exact same position. So edit, copy, edit, paste. So now I have 2 cylinders sitting in exactly the same spot. And what it does is the one that gets pasted will become the one that's selected. So now I can hit the move tool, and I can slide this over. So now I have 2 matching towers. And the other thing is I can kind of see my grid here, so I can use this to my advantage and make this a little bit more symmetrical. So I can just see how this is lining up. And again, depending on your default grid settings, yours might be a little bit different than mine. But again, we're just overall eyeballing this. We're not trying to make it perfect right now. We're just getting used to dropping in the primitive shapes and then moving those around and manipulating them. So let's go ahead and make the two front pillars. So I'm going to actually, instead of starting from scratch with a new one, I'm just going to grab this and this cylinder at the same time, copy paste it, and move them forward. So double click, hold the shift key so I can select again, double click. So now I have both of these selected. So alternatively, if I was to just left click and drag, I can grab some of these polygons, I never kind of let go of that left click. And now if I hold shift, I can double click and it'll grab both of them. Kind of the opposite of that is if I do the same thing, some polygons in each are selected, and then I just try to double click this one, it's going to kind of deselect the one over here. So again, I want to make sure that I have the shift key held down, so double click, hold shift, double click. And then I'm just going to use the hotkeys at this point. So Control C, Control V. Go ahead and use my transform or my move tool and just move this forward. Then I'll go ahead and hit the escape key. So now what I want to do is, if I look carefully at that image that I had in the beginning of the video, these two pillars were a little bit lower than these two pillars. So let's grab the top two polygons. So click, hold shift, click. Now I'm going to either hit W to move or go to my move widget over here. And I'm just going to move these down just a little bit. Something like that. Now let's go ahead and put the toppers on both of these. So the ones in the back had cones. So I'm going to hold the Control key, left click on the cone, and that's going to put a cone right in the middle of the scene. You can see that this is kind of shaped. It's a little bit too big, but using our move tools, we'll go ahead and move it back. And now to line it up with this, again, we'll go over snapping tools later, but we're just going to eyeball this one. I'm going to go to the top view, I'm going to zoom in. I can see where that cylinder's at. Now I can just kind of eyeball this and get it about in the center. So that should be good. So go back to our perspective camera. Oops. So something weird just happened. I zoomed in and then I zoomed out. So now it's trying to rotate around about this point right here. Again, even if I move my camera over here, or my mouse over here, it's still trying to move around this point right here. So this is a common thing, and it can feel a little bit weird. So if this ever happens, what you can do is you can just hit the A key, and again, that'll kind of re-zoom in on everything. So now when I zoom around, it's behaving a little bit more friendly. So now what I'm going to do is just grab this cone, slide it up, and again, instead of switching to a different camera view, I'm just going to kind of go from a lower angle and just set that right on top. So now I need to use my scale tool. So let's go ahead and switch to the scale tool. Again, I can either hit the R key or go right here. I'm going to make it not as big around, but now I'll show you two different ways of doing this. So let's actually copy paste, hit W to move, and move this one over here. So again, these should match up pretty nicely. Go ahead and go to that top view. Just make sure that this is lined up. Yeah, that's good. Hit undo. Go back to my perspective camera. So two different ways of handling this. The first way I'm going to do it is I'm actually going to switch to vertices. I'm going to grab this little vertice on top, hit W to move or go to this move widget. I'm just going to pull this down, something like that. And that looks pretty good. So now doing the same thing with this one, I'm just going to do it in a different method. So switch to polygon mode. Again, the hotkeys for this are 1, 2, and 3, and I'll just out of muscle memory, I'll be hitting those. So select the polygons, go to our scale tool, and now we're going to scale this in just the green axis or the y-axis. So you'll notice the bottom lifts up and the top lifts down. I'll just make these two shapes about pretty comparable, but you'll also notice that kind of the bottom lifted up off of this. Now we're going to have to go back to the move tool and put that back down on top. So again, we have pretty much the same results, but just a different way of doing it. Again, we'll just tweak that a little bit, and if I wanted to get really fancy, I could go to the right or left view, and I could move this up or down and make sure that these are kind of lined up. So again, we're not doing anything, I guess, too fancy. We're just making sure things are lined up a little bit better. And the other thing that you'll notice is in the video you might be hearing my hotkeys kind of going back and forth, but I'm always looking around my object making sure things are good. So it might seem a little bit sporadic, but again, as I'm doing this, my eyes are kind of darting to different locations and making sure that things are good. So again, this is just another one of those reasons that just having the hotkeys of movement down and being able to get into little areas and just look at something, inspect it, make sure that it's good, and then zoom back out and see everything as a whole. It's just a good practice to do. So the next thing that I want to look at is the little tops on the front towers. So these are going to be cylinders. So again, I'll hold the control key and I'll tap on a cylinder and I get this guy right here. And then I can use the move, scale, and rotate tools to kind of move these in place right here. So what I'm going to do is, let's go ahead and move this into place. And actually, let's put this underneath and you'll see why in a second. I'm just moving it down a little bit. Go to the top view. I'm just moving this like this. So again, this is just making it to where I can see that top, or I guess will be the bottom cylinder. So comparatively, if this was up too high and I was looking at this from the top, I wouldn't be able to see that bottom cylinder again. So this is just using the intersection of the shapes to my advantage. Switch to the scale tool. Scale this down. Move it up. We're just kind of fine-tuning this a little bit. Again, making sure that it's not, if I get to this angle, you can see that it's kind of floating there. If yours is actually floating and you don't notice, it's not a big deal. Again, this is just us getting used to things. So I'm just going to move that down just a little bit. There we go. So the next thing that I'm going to do is just kind of getting your guys' minds thinking of how we would do things. Instead of just copy pasting the top and then trying to line it back up over here, I'm actually just going to grab this whole cylinder and I'm going to delete it. And then I'm going to grab these two as a whole. So again, select some polygons on this one, select some polygons on this one. I can hold the shift key and double click, or again, I can hold shift, double click, keep holding shift, double click, just selecting both of these. And then I can quickly do a copy, paste, W to move, and I can slide this over. And then if I want, I can go to a front view and just make sure that these are lined up a little bit better, somewhere around right there. So again, that's just a different way of doing it. We grabbed both things, copy pasted them, moved them over. There's usually a bunch of different ways to do things in 3D, so I'm just trying to show you as many options as possible just so you can kind of see a bunch of different ways of doing things. So the next thing that we need to do is the walls. So for those, we're just going to use a series of boxes. So let's do the side walls first. I'm going to hold the control key, left click, and that gives me my 1 meter by 1 meter box. And I go ahead, just move that up. Again, making sure that it's just slightly clipping through the bottom floor so it's not hovering at all. And from here, I'm going to use a combination of my scale tool and then grabbing this top polygon and moving it down. So first, let's make it as thick or thin as it needs to be. And then let's worry about the length. Just a little bit. We're going to grab that top polygon, switch to the move tool, bring it down, and we have our first wall. So for the second wall, we're just going to grab this wall, copy paste, so Control C, Control V, switch to the move tool. Again, I use W, E, and R for move, rotate, and scale respectively. Just move him over like so. And now we need to put in a back wall, so let's just grab this wall right here. And again, we'll do that, copy paste, switch to the move tool, and move it over. Again, I'm using this little guy right here, so I'm only moving it on the X and the Z axis. It's not kind of going up and down in the air at all. So from here I need to rotate this 90 degrees. So we'll switch to the rotate tool. And what we can either do is we can either start rotating so we can see what axis we need to put it on. Let's hit the undo key. Again, that's Control Z or edit undo, either or. But when we did rotate that, we see that it's rotating on the Y axis. So we could either go in here and put in 90 degrees and hit enter and then put this into place. Or just another thing to show you, have the rotate tool activated. And then I'm just going to hold the control key, grab our green handle, so it's going to rotate around the y-axis. So hold Control, left click. Now you can see that it's kind of snapping in little increments. So again, I said I wasn't going to really cover any snapping tools, but this is a really useful one because again, down here you can see it snaps 15 degrees at a time to give you kind of a easier time setting up where this needs to be. So we'll kind of get this about in the middle, switch to the scale tool and scale it out. And again, if yours is scaled out a little bit more like this, or like really narrow like this, it doesn't really matter as long as it's clipping through. The thing that I wouldn't like to see is just it being like this, because then, again, bad guys could get through your walls and that's no fun. So let's do something like that. So now what we need to do is we had that little series of walls right here. So effectively there's a wall that came through like this, but then there's a door right here. So it looked something like this, drawn in with my little lasso tool. So instead of cutting up a box at this point, I'm just going to use 3 different boxes. Next week we'll go over how to cut things up, but for now we'll just use kind of what we have. So again, I could start with a new box, but just because this is placed in a good way, let's go ahead and grab this and we'll do cut paste, switch to the move tool. So again, Control C, Control V, W to move. Again, that's if you like hotkeys. If you don't, you can use these that I've mentioned in the past. So I'm just going to move this up. So now we have effectively no way to get into our castle. So I will scale this in, go ahead and move it over. And again, our castle it's pretty close to centered. We can see we have our blue z-axis line and our red x-axis line. So ideally I want a little cut right here for people to get in. So let's grab this wall, switch to the move tool and just move that over a little bit. And then I can do the same thing of this, where I just copy paste and move. So again, there's a lot of copy paste going on in here. I don't want to do anything too complicated because realistically at this point we're just getting kind of settled in with navigating, moving, scaling, rotating, and then creating new primitive tools. So, and again, my camera was getting a little bit wonky, so I just hit that A key and then it rotates a little bit better for me. So now what I need to do is I need to put in a third little floating brick right here. And again, the magic of 3D, there's no gravity going on, so I can just have floating bricks. So let's do a quick copy paste, click that move tool, then we can get this right in place. I will use the scale tool. If I want, this might be one of those good ones to switch to that front view so I can kind of see what's going on with this. And again, this is another one of those things that if you have it close enough, that's probably fine. I'm not looking for these to be perfect by any means. And the other thing just to be aware of, this is kind of a little bit of a trick. If I zoom out and I use my move arrow, and let's actually hit the escape key to drop our move tool and hit the move tool again. And I want you to pay attention to the increments over here. If I slowly drag this over, you can see that it's going 10 millimeters, 15 millimeters, 20. It's doing little increments of 5 millimeters. But if I zoom way in and I do a movement, now you can see it's doing not even increments of 5, it's doing increments of 0.5. So 5, 5.5, 6, and I'm moving my mouse really slowly. And again, zooming way out, it's just going to kind of auto-calibrate. Now it's going to do big chunks. Now it's doing 10 millimeters. So the amount that your 3D object moves is kind of almost based on how much you're zoomed in. Because again, if you're zoomed way in, they assume you want to do some fine tweaking. But if you're zoomed out a little bit farther, you really can't see the gap between that wall. So they assume that you want to do a bigger movement. And again, that movement is kind of based on screen space. So again, if I move my mouse up and down like this is a much shorter distance than moving my mouse up and down at this point. I mean, my mouse is moving the same distance, but the object in the scene won't move the same distance, so it kind of compensates over here. So at this point, this is looking pretty good. Let's go back to our perspective view. I'll just hit that A key to zoom back in. So now we have something like this. So lastly, a thing that you might have not noticed at first is there's a little pile of logs right here. So let's take care of those really quick. So what I'm going to do is drop in a new cylinder really quickly. So it should come in about right here. So I'm going to hold that control key, click on our cylinder, and then From here, I can go ahead and select this. Now I want to rotate it so it's laying on its side. So I'm going to hold that Control key, left click. You can see the little 15 degree increments. I can kind of get the space again. This is a very big log at this point. So I'll go ahead and scale it down. It's about the length I want. Now I want it to be a thinner log. So instead of uniformly scaling it down, so to uniformly scale, you're going to grab this middle cyan guy, and this it'll keep all its same proportions. What I want to do is I want to make it not as tall and not as wide. So to do that, I'm going to use this little red handle right here. So it's scaling on the y-axis and the z-axis at the same time, but it's keeping the same length this way. And again, that's grabbing this little red handle. So about right there, we have the log that we want. And now I'm just going to stack these. So I'll probably do 3 and then 2 and then 1. Just zoom right in, make sure that's sitting on the ground. So from here, what I'm going to do is let's actually drop that move tool. So hit the escape key or spacebar. And then from here I can do copy, paste. So I have 2 logs sitting in the same spot. Left click the move tool, pull this out. Now let's do the same thing with hotkeys, Control C, Control V. Move tool is already activated, so we can move that over. So now let's be a little bit more fancy and we'll click, hold shift, double click, so we have both of them. Do a cut paste, a copy paste. W to move both of those up. And again, they're going to be really little on screen, so I don't need to focus on making sure they're perfectly nested in each other. Grab one, copy paste, W to move, and go right here. And again, if you don't like hotkeys, it's perfectly fine using these up here. I've just been doing 3D so long that that's kind of my fastest way of doing it, and it's just muscle memory at this point. There we go. Now the logs are done. So at this point, our castle we can say is done. Realistically, this looks like a toy castle that a kid would make out of building blocks. It's not anything fancy. And then the other thing to mention is this isn't like a game-ready asset or something that you'd put in a movie. Again, this is just a kind of crude practice to get you guys used to moving, scaling, rotating, dropping primitive shapes, cut, copy, paste geometry, working with meshes, etc. So in a future video, we're going to be going over saving and loading in a little bit more detail, but if you wanted to save this out so you could use it later for something, just go to File, hit Save As, and then it's going to have your normal hierarchy of where you want to save it, what you want to call it, and then for now just leave it as this default file type, hit Save, and then you'll be all set.